mostly about correctly nesting entities. So those are a lot of words, so let's talk about what they mean. Oops. My name is Amy Hannaford. I'm the owner and architect of Spatial Path. I previously was the owner and co-founder of Hook 42 and principal architect. I've been working with multilingual sites and Drupal for a very long time. And I was also the author of the Drupal 8 multilingual training assets used globally. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I do a lot of things across the business and technical worlds. So I'm here to talk about a lot of different things. But I'm going to go pretty quickly. Christian is not here today, but we did this presentation together, and he's from Lingotech. So he's here with me in spirit and with us with information. And he's been an avid contributor to Drupal and Drupal Multilingual for years. I also want to say thank you for the Drupal GovCon organizers, the global Drupal multilingual team, Pantheon for all of the test sites I used to work on this book, Lingotech and Hook 42, and I'll be using some of the assets from the old company along the way because they're very sweet. Hello, hola. About this scope, we're going to do mostly 8+. Can't cover everything. It's going to be around content, and I'm going to go pretty quickly. So it's going to be like drinking from a fire hose of data. This is a blessing and a curse for everybody, but we're going to cover a lot of topics. I'm trying to make sure we have some time for questions. Please feel free to ask questions along the way in context of when I'm talking, because I'll be able to address that. So let's get going. We're really here because multilingual sites are hard, and a lot of times you'll have a wonderful site, everything's set up, and then your client comes in, internal or external, and says, let's add Spanish. And then you're at a point where going like, okay, how do I make that happen? And what choices did I make creating the English version or the first language version that I might have to revisit as I add another language? So first of all, Drupal is an awesome, powerful platform, feature-rich, extensible, and it's multilingual, and that's why we're here. And there are a lot of moving parts to make a functional website, and it's even more making a multilingual one. And so there's some expectations versus reality here. Through the course of making a multilingual site, you want to prevent anybody being very unhappy by making sure everybody has clear expectations of what multilingual is supposed to do for the business and technically, to provide a predictable and functional website. And that word predictable is important because the business needs confidence in their multilingual investment. So the reality is, with great flexibility comes complexity, and that's in the site building approaches and the editing interfaces and the theme layers, the publication workflows, customizations. There's so many permutations that there's a lot of border cases for everybody's use. So that makes it really hard to hit a constantly evolving target for success. And adding multilingual support will exponentially increase your test cases and complexity as you implement something. So once again, where there is great power comes great responsibility, from Uncle Ben and Winston Churchill. So let's start and do a little bit of understanding about multilingual content and site strategy. So translation versus localization. Translation is just the words and meaning from one language to another. But localization is adapting product or content, application or document to meet the language and the cultural and other requirements of a target market. So what you can see here is a sample of a warning sign from Spain, but you can see that the animals are different that you'll see on the road based on their contextual location. So that is, I'm using the warning sign experience to show different information, but it conveys a very similar meaning. So that's a very simple covering of localization. As we get through this conversation, you're going to hear some words called symmetrical and asymmetrical, and they're really tied to this translated versus localized. So symmetrical is a layout display is the same between the source locale and the destination locale of the same content entity. So node 1 in English is directly translated and looks the same in the other languages. So when you switch between languages, it looks the same, but asymmetrical is the layout display and translated versions may content, they may differ through each locale, and the content translations are not strictly tied to the source language too. They're often decoupled, and it gets a bit tricky, and the translated locales can look different from the source locale, even if it's just a wee bit different. So as you get into your multilingual needs, you want to define the content business rules and a language first approach through discovery and being realistic. But this is beyond just your site technology or the content. This is understanding the resources, what languages you want to reach in your markets, the purpose of the content, the interface and how you're working and displaying that content, also and how do you create it and store the content within Drupal. So there's a lot of stuff to consider. And then also, this is a huge one, is define display expectations. So what needs to change on the site. And the really big use case, everybody will say, oh yeah, no, just we need to translate the content. And that's actually true for maybe 90% is the same as the source language. And then that sneaky 10% has locale specific content, but that requirement being added will inform your translation configurations and decisions across the site. So this is where you say, oh, is it a region that changes, or is it mid-content? That type of thing. So, or does it change drastically? Do you have to have a whole different theme because your Japanese region wants to have a much different interface or something like that? And then you want to define the content creation system, like the people and tools that are using it, mostly because there's a lot about what tools you need to interface with the source content and the translation content, especially if you're going to start localizing and making locale specific content. And then this really, the big arrow is, what is the proposed Drupal layout approach? Because there's a lot of developers and agencies that will come in and they have a predefined way that their agency works. Are they a paragraph shop, or are they a layout builder shop, or are they in a node reference shop? So instead, the technology teams will come with a predefined approach before they hear the business needs. And that happens a lot. And so that is really important when you talk about these sites, because that really drives your content storage and field planning. And these are some questions you need to ask for each field of any content entity. So does it stay the same? Do the values stay the same but need to be displayed in a different language? And is it non-translated or language specific information? And how will the content be displayed? Is it a link and that type of thing? All of these things are very important as you walk through your nesting approach. And the big thing is, a lot of people don't understand in your project team maybe what multilingual means. So really make sure you take the time as a group to define what translation and localization mean to everybody. So as the business stakeholders work with the technology teams, everybody understands what they want to have happen with different content types and what is needing to change across locales. And this is even beyond like the roadmap of just what is right now. Maybe it's some understanding what needs to happen in the future, and then write everything down. And media content needs to be done very early, because if you fail to plan, then you are planning to fail, and that's the truth. So we're going to get into some multilingual and nesting fundamentals. Some expectations are that Drupal's multilingual system will work all the time because it's in core. And even though it was built with a language first approach, that like content entities are aware and they have fallback rules. Even though it's a language aware, it's not just content, and things do happen. There's a lot of edge cases because there's language detection, language fallback. There's a lot of things that can be done in the display and theme layer. There's a lot of extensions from Contrib that can do some very interesting things, and we'll cover those later. And then additional site customizations and also interaction with the editing interfaces. So just because it's a really good place to start doesn't mean that you won't run into some issues. And multilingual pillars based of Drupal 8 is language. So it's this language is everywhere in all media entity or in all entities and core APIs. Then you have the interface and your content and your config. And those are covered with 4 modules: the language module, config translation module, content translation module, and interface translation module. I put those here to help remind everybody that those things exist, but we're going to talk mostly about content here. Content entities, there's many types: so node, taxonomy, term, media, custom blocks. Content entities can be translated or not. That's it, one or another. Content entities have language display fallback rules. So if a translation exists, then it shows the translation. If it doesn't, what happens? And those are configurable. And then content entities have fields, and fields can be translated if desired. But the parent entity, like a content type, must be configured for translation if any fields within the content type need to be translated. This relates to beyond just content types. It's media types and it's everything. A field can't be translated unless its parent containing content bundle is. And and I just said that. Only if the content bundle is configured. And so we have translated or not, and then a field can be one of 2 types: content containing or entity relationships, like it's a pointer to another one. So that's it. So we have 2 rules now that have 2 things: translated or not, content or a pointer. Quick overview: content field types are all the different flavors of text, number, Boolean, and links. Image, the entity reference types, even the image file field is kind of the, yeah, it's its own thing, but a lot of those other ones are like really clear entity types. So we're going to get into those in a second. All right, this is the third thing to know. If the third if then. When a field is translated, the field's value can change across locales. So if translated, content can change. If the field is not translated, the content stays the same. This applies to every field and every nesting depth. So you're like, why is it that hard though when you get into a multilingual site? Well, we'll get into that, and it comes into nesting and also losing track of what value for translation is set where. And it's going to be interesting. We'll get into that. So don't just mark every field translatable on your site, because it causes confusion to the content team. It can cause weird, unexpected site bugs during translation processes. And if you're using a text or a taxonomy term list to define a layout, don't translate it. Possibly, or at least don't translate the content, because you might have it tied to a class in your CSS, and that would make it break. I've seen a lot of that in audits. Make sure that you understand field constraints, because a word that might be 5 characters in English may be 10 or 15 in German. And also required status, because if you have content that is going through a translation process and it fails to come back in, node saves might not actually work. So it's a big deal. And also, how are you using content moderation and publication status? Some content field multilingual configurations. The configuration of translated content is if you have a source green and you have translated the destination into Spanish, verde, it will show that translation. But the translation must exist to display in Spanish, right? So a lot of times people will go, hey, why is that word still showing green? It's because the translation doesn't exist yet. So content would be displayed using fallback rules. Entity references, these pointers. A non-translated entity reference. So the source and entity references are basically a bunch of list of numbers it's pointing to an entity ID, right? And it has an order in which you're pointing to the other ID. So the source value for English may be entity 1 or entity 2. And if you do not translate the entity reference field, the parent entity in a translation will have the same exact value. But the expected behavior is if the content for the Spanish is a translation of the English source, the parent entity, like English, the parent entity of translated, the Spanish node 1, will show the Spanish versions of entity 1 and entity 2. But if it's translated, you can change the entity pointers from English on your Spanish translation. And this is often coming up if you have like a product variant that is available, perhaps in the US and one that's in Spain, but they're not in each other's regions. So there's another example where you can see this. So I'm just gonna move on. So I'm gonna talk about widgets because widgets actually are a really big player in multilingual. Their field widgets are used to render and work with the field inside of forms. They're plugin. Some widgets alter the data model on form save or form interactions. And there's bugs along with those widgets. And Benji and I know really well some really sneaky inline entity form bugs that we had to work through on a multilingual site. But these things are real. Like the widgets, if they alter the content on a translated site, they can lose track of some languages, especially if your nesting entities are very deep. So this is a big deal, and you have to keep it in your troubleshooting stack with multilingual. So nesting, I've used this term a few times. It's to include one or more content entities within another content entity, either by a reference field or an extended entity manager like an entity browser. All multilingual content bundles and field level configurations expectations apply for each nested bundle. So that weird bunch of words just means it's gonna, all those rules we talked about are the same for every level of the nesting. You have to apply those expectations to every level. And you want to plan, test, don't assume, revisit, and translate it. So it's fun, but there's going to be some problems. So the big thing is, why is the wrong language showing? That's, are the translations configured correctly, including all depth layers of the nesting? Check your configs again. Settings must be correct everywhere. Check for field reuse, right? Like if you are using a media entity reference field on 2 different content types, and perhaps some of the global configuration changed on one, it might affect the other. Also, do the translations exist? And are they published? And are the permissions correct? Can you see those? These are very basic CMS questions you have to ask, but it really actually plays a huge thing with debugging multilingual. And we talked about the widgets manipulating the content and the nested entities do not get past the correct languages. I have some symptoms here, but I'm going to move on because we're going to do a lot of stuff. So people use content choices. Benji asked a question. Source and parent entities. Do you mean source and translated? Yes. Sorry. I've been chatting a lot and fast, so I'll slow down a little bit. Thank you. So I'll show another example. It's going to be clearer for everybody to see. It's visual. So a lot of times when you're debugging multilingual, people use content choice plus display logic at many different levels, either like within a paragraph, within a field, within a node template, within the theme, within a view, so much beyond what's provided in core. And those permutations can cause a lot of unexpected results and bugs. So these are just more layers of the stack to actually look through. And the big thing here, the decreased site performance happens a lot with multilingual, because the minute you had many, many languages, and if you're using something like paragraphs or lots of blocks, It increases the number of nodes. You have a high number of loaded entities per rendered page. There's many revisions stored in each edit, and you get a lot of storage. So it does, like revisions can multiply by the number of supported locales and the number of times you update a node, so, or update a content entity. And all of a sudden you just can explode in database size, and you're like, why is my site so slow? That's why. There's a lot of stuff in the background. So we're going to talk about how can we avoid that. And that's the first rule of entity nesting is don't nest, but let's be realistic. You can't not nest, right? Because if by the definition, even having one entity reference on a node is going to be nesting. You're pointing to another entity. It's just, we're going to talk about safely nesting. The second rule of entity nesting is don't use a data model for layout. And there's a referenced talk I have much later in the end of the deck that was basically talking about paragraphs was never meant to be a layout tool, but it is. And what happens is the data model used for layout has a lot of like repercussions about, revision size, database impact, and also usability. So the takeaway from this is choose the right nesting approach for your business needs. And the third rule of entity nesting is keep it simple and consistent. Make sure that if you're working with media, you know that you have a very consistent way of working with all media fields across the board. Or you have well-defined media fields. So you want to make sure that it's not something that you have to chase all the time. So these are really true nesting levels. So you have a page with one paragraph and another, that's a layout, like my 2-column, and then the paragraph 2 is all the content fields, and the third layer is that media reference. You've got like 4 nesting levels right there. And there's another true one, landing page, paragraph 2, product page, media reference. So just look at that and go, oh, hey, the workflow for landing page is different than the paragraphs possibly, and then different from the product page and different from the media. So you can see that the complexity is beyond just Drupal. It's beyond just language. It's also how do you align all of those moving pieces of content everywhere. So which entities are the worst nesting offenders? It's humans. Just kidding, but not really. It's paragraphs, node references, block references, and custom content entities. And why did that happen? Well, there wasn't anything else available for editors to control layouts very well, especially in Drupal 8. But there's layout management for end users is improving, especially through that layout builder interface. And you might be asking, what about my site? It might have been older and you're in this paragraphs kind of approach, and it might be deeply nested, and really transitioning, it takes a lot of effort, possibly, and possible migration work. And then once again, fields should follow the same multilingual basics. The questions to ask yourself for configuring translatability: is it different between locales? Is it reused somewhere else, right? So especially if you're coming into going like, oh, I have this block. I want to put this block in my content, whether it be, or I'm using paragraph libraries. I've got this paragraph in the library. I want to use it other places. That has a different workflow, right? And, or is the nested entity used on its own anywhere, right? Can it be navigated to? So a lot of these rules apply to these edge cases and also headless sites using Drupal as a backend. So some nesting examples for the single entity reference. I'm using just one example, but a lot of things apply to it. Is the taxonomy used for display rules or CSS? Don't translate it. Only translate the entity reference if you want the display to change per locale. So if you want to let the content editors change the display color, sure, but just don't change the term. And the expected behavior is terms passing classes should not be translated or changed. Single entity reference, is the taxonomy used for content categorization? So is this taxonomy driving your your like wonderful search interfaces or lists. You want to create those taxonomy terms and translate those in a separate workflow because they are separate and special because they drive semantic structure on your site. The entity reference field normally should not be translated. For example, if I have a node that's talking about a blue iris, that blue iris doesn't change from being blue if you go into German or Spanish. So those entity reference fields are normally not translated. And, but you want to translate the term itself. So the value stays the same, but blue is shown on English and azul is shown on Spanish. And is the taxonomy term used for free-form tagging or user-generated content? And if so, maybe don't translate those. Maybe those are terms are locale-specific ones because it gets really costly. This is the visual that I'm talking about here. Here's a taxonomy example of the source parent entity. So Benji here, it's the source language and it's the containing kind of parent entity is a content type and it's in English. It has one field that is a term entity reference that is not translated. So my expected behavior is that these values will stay the same on every type of language. And it's true, blue, azul, blue. All of these values are the same, but you're like, wait a second, not translated one looks like English in all versions because it is, because the bug here is that the term isn't translated. And it's the same bug with small. The term is not translated. So this is where, this is getting into debugging, your nesting. So the term ER, this is the entity reference list translated. So I'm expecting the values to change per language. So I'm going to start here and say yellow, large, not translated 2. But in Spanish, I want yellow, but it's small and not translated 1. So you can see here, the bug still here is that small and not translated is not in, there's no Spanish version of it. But it's not a bug if you want to be able to choose different taxonomy values. And then you can see here, French again is a whole different setting. So is this making sense? Everybody give me a shout out into Zoom chat or some chat if you guys are doing okay. So, but I'm gonna go in because the fire hose is going. It's so Friday, it'll be fun. So once again, some common entity reference field widgets that you'll be working with is, I'll type that out later. I typed it out earlier, is inline entity form, simple and complex. The entity browser, media browser, there's a taxonomy term pickers, there's multiple field widgets, and then there's paragraphs, IEF as well if you're using paragraphs. So lather, rinse, repeat. The taxonomy example, you can apply to every entity reference type, and each content type does have unique questions, or each content entity type. So media, you have to ask different questions about that type of content just because a media workflow is different. And you know, that type of thing. And or if you're working with custom entities like products or product variants, you gotta go through that. So I put a bunch of some reference at the end of this deck for custom blocks and media examples because those come up quite a bit. So the big complex nesting things that are happening is a reminder a little bit about symmetrical and asymmetrical. Symmetrical, the layout, it stays the same. The text changes. Asymmetrical, the layout can change drastically, and some values can also change within that, some content values. So let's talk about paragraphs because everybody loves those. So who has used paragraphs before? Probably everybody. Yeah, I see the videos that are nodding, which is good. So I'm just going to assume they are. There are requirements from contrib, which is paragraphs, and entity reference revision, because a paragraph this little chunk needs to tie to its parent, and it's a revision-based thing. So there is a new extension for multilingual support. It's called Paragraphs Asymmetric Translation Widget. And it's fairly new and updated. I know that Christian was working on it heavily. It lets people localize paragraphs instead of just being able to translate paragraphs. So let me get into this example. So a single entity reference is a node with paragraphs, and paragraphs' goal was to provide flexible structure of content, especially with using multiple fields, and it's not conceived as layout. And are different translations going to allow different paragraphs? That is a really good question to ask in your content strategy, because it requires really good planning before you, so you know if you choose symmetrical or asymmetrical translation. It defines the best configuration. And you only translate the entity reference revision for paragraphs if you want the content to change per locale. And a lot of times people will be like, oh yeah, we don't need the asymmetrical, but I'll get into a couple of use cases that really do show that you do. So if you do not have the extra contrib module, then don't translate the field for paragraphs, but that means your layout by paragraph plus core contrib, the default behavior assumes all the paragraphs on the source language will show translated field data. And so that means every paragraph for English will be there for Spanish. And a lot of times, the way folks use paragraphs in the real world is that they might have layout changes for different regions, like especially for like compliance, like if you have a product compliance and it's an electrical product, for every region and locale you need to do is you have to have different content saying, hey, my electrical spec is this for this region. So these asymmetrical considerations come into play. A lot of times I've seen people have a little tiny field that has language in there and they choose the language display at their theme layer. The twig has the values to say, please show this or not, just because they wanted to have asymmetrical content before asymmetrical was supported for paragraphs. So they kind of built it. So you'll see a lot of that in the wild, like people making something work for their needs at that moment. So there's no judgment for that. It's just a reality. So here's what it looked like with a node with a single level paragraphs. And the paragraphs, this is the way paragraphs were intended to be used. One level, a group of fields. And you can see that in English, there's 2 values. And in Spanish, we have one more value. It comes up, and it's the it's a Drupal Camp Spain. So that itself would need to be asymmetric because you have an additional paragraph in the translation. If you just put that there, it would be interesting to see what happens to the other sites. So this is why a really focused content strategy has to come up very early. When you're making multilingual sites or when you're adding multilingual to a site. So Layout Builder, it's provided in core. It provides a neat user interface for layout configuration. I didn't get a screen grabby, I'm sorry about this, but it's much nicer looking than paragraphs to interact with. It stores block and layout information in the content entity itself, just like translations. And the blocks created with Layout Builder are non-reusable blocks. They only exist within the scope of the content entity. And so you can use Layout Builder for 2 things. You can create like your display layout configs. And for those who have worked with like panels or old display suite, it's that like content type level display layout. But then they also provide Layout Builder overrides, which is layout edits per content entity, which is like the marketing folks going, I want to make a landing page builder. If that's, but we get the sales arrows too. So that Layout Builder is used to define, so when you use Layout Builder for a default display structure, the content entities and fields follow all translation rules we talked about. And if the translation exists and the field is displayed in Layout Builder, the field displays in the correct language. And the use of reusable custom blocks will follow the basic blocks pattern. So all of these things, if your block is translated and it shows up on the Spanish page based on your default layout, it will show Spanish. There are interesting issues with blocks because the titles are properties, and are you showing a title versus are you showing the description? That's always a big challenge, and we're still working through that challenge at that Layout Builder area. So Layout Builder for entity level overrides out of core provides these wonderful tools, and if only fields on the content entity are used, then the translation should display okay. And all locales of the entity will have the same layout the layout if it's using the Layout Builder from core. And the creation of custom blocks within Layout Builder will maintain their source language. And it gets a little challenging around those. But if you use a reusable block, like one that, maybe you're placing a promotional block that's used lots of places, it will follow that standalone blocks reference pattern. So if the block is translated, then the block would show the correct language. You can see that there is a rhythm and there is a pattern that is the same for expectations around multilingual, regardless if you're using content. The tough part is when you are like, is that a bug or is that intended behavior? That's always the challenge. So Layout Builder Contrib provides the two models for managing layout for overrides, these per entity layouts, but you can only choose one method per site, and choose mindfully, because switching from one to another is really hideous. It takes a lot of work. And I'm sorry, Benji, I think we did that at one point together. Asymmetric translations is a module called Layout Builder AT, and each locale can support localized content, but after the first translation from the source language, content and display are completely decoupled per locale. And that sounds great if you have content teams in different areas all working on the same node, but it gets challenging when you're working with something like a translation management system where you have to track, write it in English first, send it to translation, and have it come back. So asymmetric adds levels of complexity to workflow based on your internal team structure. So, oh, okay, yeah, maybe I fixed that. Benji says no. I think I fixed the bug on the site where I had swapped it from one to another. I'm really early adopter with these things, and I was working a lot with the Core Layout Builder team at the beginning, so I was very excited to use it. So very in-depthly that's why I'm writing this presentation, is that there was a lot of things that came up in using Layout Builder versus paragraphs versus blocks that needed to be shared. But the symmetric translations, the source and translated locales are kept in sync, which is great. And the pro or con is that the display is in the same across all locales. So it's interesting. So some considerations here: the translated locales can look different from the source. Each translation forks off the source languages, and choose only one. Test this a lot, and using Layout Builder and using widgets to control how you're interacting with the node edit forms start adding a lot of complexity, especially if you're using a really rich media entity strategy. And these Layout Builder blocks are just blocks. They're basically, it's almost the same as having a paragraph. And you can even use paragraphs within Layout Builder, right? So they are fields that can hold other fields and nest other fields. So if you, each one has its own technical implications on the back end of how they're used at the low level, but as you're working with translation and expected behavior of what you see, they're pretty much the same. So we're always looking and improving the tooling efforts, including making it smoother to switch from asym to symmetrical models. Some modules to help clean up bloated revisions in the database. And there's a lot of people trying to do as much multilingual testing as you can, but always make sure you test beyond the Drupal interface, please. Because multilingual with all the moving parts actually can feel buggy because there are so many parts that can speak up, like, you know, perk up as being an error. So plan, test, don't assume, revisit and translate. Okay, I'm not saying goodbye yet. Please, does anybody have any questions? Please ask. And I see some folks from my training, so I'm really happy to see you. And it's probably like hearing it again, you're like, whoa. Hopefully I did okay. If there's no questions, then did I go, that might be a good job, or that it's 5 o'clock and so, oh, thank you. Thank you. Or it's very late on Friday for the East Coast team. I'm gonna click through a couple of things. So there's some resources, a wonderful entity reference deck from Chris and Jacob for dealing with entity references and data models, and our connection here for our emails. And there's a bunch of field other like topics at the end. So test lists, list link. Here's Node with reusable custom blocks, lots of those. And then I did some media entity here because it adds some questions that you would ask yourself for these things. So, and I think that's really the end. That's really the end. That's end to end. That's like the end of movies where they have the little scene at the end. Any tips for multilingual migrations? You know what, did I have that multilingual audit slide or did I take it out? I might have, like, so for multilingual migrations, yes. Some of the hardest things with migrations is the amount of content cleanup one should be doing to get it into the correct destination. So the worst thing that you end up seeing, and I've seen it on a lot of audits too, like Hook 42 managed the audits for Lingotech for all their sales stuff coming through. So we saw a lot of different footprints of site building and impacts of stuff. A lot of people, because they want to just get the content into Drupal, they'll run migrations, but they don't go through the term cleanup and make sure that the terms are in the right language. Same thing with media. Like they'll just go, okay, here's 1,000 product manuals, get them in there, right? But because the source didn't have language, nobody went through the cleaning pathway to define language. Or like for media, the good and right thing is if you should have one media object with all translations of that similar thing together. So that a lot of it is just lots of audits, lots of questions, knowing what you need to do in the future. Yeah, thanks. If you're migrating into Drupal 8.8+, then you can migrate translations and revisions in one pass along with the source nodes. Oh yeah, thank you, Benji, because I was gonna ask Benji, how is the migration team? So Benji's on the core migration team, which is excellent. I knew that things were being worked on to get multilingual migrations taken care of. I'm gonna say thank you, Benji, for working on that because it's something that we needed to do, but always make sure that you are really aware of what your source and your destination is, because a lot of times just pressing the button might not give you the expected outcome that you're looking for. And it's, especially if you're coming from like a Drupal 7 hybrid, you know, content translation versus entity translation environment, it might just, you might have to do a lot of unraveling. Oh, okay. Benji was saying that was all somebody, Mike Lutz quiet tone, but that's okay. Thank you for representing and letting people know. Yeah, is there anything else, I think? And Ratio, is there anything, oh, cool. I was going to say, is there anything else that,